German officers gathered around the captured American vehicle with open amusement. It was small, light, and exposed, nothing like the armored machines they trusted to dominate the battlefield. There was no steel plating, no turret, and no sense of intimidation. Parked beside German tanks and troop carriers, the vehicle looked out of place, almost fragile. To experienced commanders who had watched Europe fall under the weight of panzers, this odd machine seemed laughable. Some dismissed it as a transport for farmers. Others joked that the Americans had sent it by accident. In their minds, wars were decided by firepower, by thick armor, and by machines built to crush everything in their path. From their perspective, the judgment made sense. The vehicle offered no real protection to its driver. A single burst of gunfire could disable it. Artillery would tear it apart instantly. It did not project strength, and it did not inspire fear. German military thinking valued control and precision, carefully planned movements, and heavy equipment designed to overpower the enemy. This small American vehicle did not fit that vision of warfare at all. It appeared to be a curiosity, not a threat, and certainly not something capable of influencing the outcome of a global conflict. What the German officers failed to understand was that the war unfolding around them was no longer defined only by size and strength. The fighting now stretched across continents, over ruined roads, frozen fields, deserts, and dense forests. Communication was often slow. Terrain was unpredictable. Commanders needed to move quickly, deliver orders fast, and reach places where traditional vehicles could not go. In this new kind of war, the ability to adapt mattered as much as raw power. Speed, reliability, and presence could decide life or death in moments that never appeared on battle maps. This small vehicle had been built for those exact conditions. It could move where trucks became stuck and where tanks could not pass. It could appear at the front lines, at command posts, and at evacuation points with little warning. While German officers judged it by appearance, American forces were using it to solve practical problems every single day. It connected units, carried wounded soldiers, and allowed leaders to see the battlefield with their own eyes. It did not dominate the enemy through fear. It simply worked when everything else failed. The laughter that surrounded the vehicle in those early moments came from misunderstanding. The Germans saw weakness where there was flexibility. They saw vulnerability where there was speed. They believed they were looking at something unimportant, something unworthy of attention. History would soon prove how costly that assumption was. Because while they laughed at the Jeep, it was already reshaping how modern warfare was fought, 1 mile of broken ground at a time. The laughter on the German side hid a deeper truth on the American side. Long before the Jeep ever reached a battlefield, the United States Army was struggling with a serious problem that few outside the military understood. Modern war demanded movement, but the tools to move men and commanders were outdated. Horses were still being used in many units, slow and vulnerable to gunfire and exhaustion. Large trucks existed, but they were heavy, clumsy, and unreliable on rough ground. When roads disappeared, so did their usefulness. As the war expanded, American planners began to see the danger clearly. Units were often separated by miles of broken terrain. Radios failed or were intercepted. Orders arrived late, or not at all. Commanders needed to move quickly between positions, but doing so often meant walking or riding exposed motorcycles that struggled in mud, snow, or sand. A delay of minutes could mean a missed opportunity or a deadly mistake. The Army had firepower, manpower, and resources, but it lacked a simple tool to connect all of them. Reports from early fighting and training exercises painted the same picture again and again. Trucks became stuck in mud after light rain. Vehicles designed for paved roads broke down under constant strain. Supply lines slowed. Medical evacuations took too long. Officers could not reach the front fast enough to understand what was happening. The battlefield moved faster than the Army's ability to respond. This was not a problem that tanks or artillery could solve. It was a problem of mobility at the smallest and most critical level. The United States Army needed something new. Something light enough to move easily, but strong enough to survive constant use, something that could travel off-road, climb steep ground, cross shallow rivers, and keep running with minimal maintenance. It had to be simple, because it would be used by exhausted soldiers under fire. It had to be reliable, because failure could cost lives. And above all, it had to be available fast. The war would not wait for perfect designs or long testing cycles. Inside the Army Quartermaster Corps, urgency replaced caution. Officers understood that without a solution, American forces would always be reacting instead of acting. The enemy was already moving quickly. If the United States wanted to fight a modern war, it needed a modern answer. Quietly, without fanfare, the search began for a vehicle that did not yet exist, one that would not win battles on its own, but would make every other part of the army work better. This was the silent crisis behind the scenes. And it set the stage for a demand that many believed was impossible to meet. The demand that followed shocked everyone who heard it. Inside the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, officers drafted a requirement that seemed completely unrealistic. They wanted a brand new military vehicle designed from scratch. It had to be light enough for soldiers to push by hand if needed. It had to carry men, equipment, and weapons. It needed four-wheel drives to survive mud, snow, sand, and broken ground. And it had to be ready almost immediately. Not in years. Not even in months. The deadline was counted in weeks. Automotive companies across the United States received the request, and many did not take it seriously. Some ignored it entirely. Others read the specifications and laughed, much like the German officers would later do. The weight limits seemed too low. The performance demands were too high. The time frame was nearly impossible. Designing a reliable vehicle normally took years of testing and refinement. The army was asking for a miracle under extreme pressure. Yet the war left no room for hesitation. Europe was burning. Asia was already in chaos. American leaders knew that once the United States entered the conflict fully, soldiers would be sent to places with no roads and no infrastructure. They would need to move fast from the very first day. This vehicle was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Failure to create it would mean slower operations, higher casualties, and lost opportunities on the battlefield. A few small companies decided to try anyway. They worked around the clock, cutting corners not in quality but in comfort. There was no time for beauty or refinement. Every decision focused on function. Engineers stripped designs down to their core purpose. No unnecessary weight. No decorative parts. Just what was needed to move and survive. Speed of production mattered as much as performance. The vehicle had to be simple enough to be built in massive numbers and repaired by soldiers with basic tools. The pressure was relentless. Deadlines approached with no extensions. Prototypes were rushed to testing grounds almost as soon as they were assembled. Engines overheated. Parts broke. Designs failed. But with every failure, adjustments were made. What mattered was not perfection but progress. Each test brought the vehicle closer to something usable, something dependable, and something that could be trusted in the chaos of war. This process revealed a shift in American military thinking. Instead of waiting for ideal solutions, the Army was willing to accept something good enough to fight now. They understood that war rewards action. A vehicle that could do many things reasonably well was more valuable than one that did a single thing perfectly. The battlefield was unpredictable, and adaptability would decide who survived and who did not. As the deadline closed in, one design began to stand out. It was not elegant. It was not impressive to look at. But it met the requirements. It moved fast. It climbed hills. It crossed mud that stopped heavier vehicles cold. And most importantly, it could be built quickly and in large numbers. The Army had asked for the impossible. And against all expectations, someone was about to deliver. Willys Overland was not the largest company competing for the Army contract, but it was the one willing to take the greatest risks. Its engineers understood that this vehicle did not need to look impressive. It needed to work. They focused on strength, simplicity, and power. The heart of their design was a small but surprisingly strong engine that delivered more torque than any competitor. It gave the vehicle the ability to climb steep slopes, and pull heavy loads despite its light frame. The prototype that emerged looked unfinished to many observers. The body was boxy and plain. The windshield folded down. The interior offered no comfort. There were no doors and no roof. Every detail that did not serve a purpose was removed. Even American officers were unsure at first. Some questioned whether soldiers would trust something that looked so exposed and rough. Others worried it would not survive sustained combat use. On paper, it seemed too simple to succeed. Then the testing began. The vehicle was driven hard, without mercy. It was sent through mud deep enough to swallow boots. It was forced up rocky hills that stopped trucks cold. It crossed streams and rutted fields. Again and again, it kept moving. When parts failed, they were redesigned quickly. When weight became an issue, steel was shaved away. The goal was not comfort or elegance. The goal was survival and motion under the worst conditions imaginable. What truly set the Willys design apart was how it balanced power and weight. Its engine allowed it to do more than just transport people. It could tow artillery. It could carry ammunition. It could pull damaged vehicles out of trouble. Soldiers began to notice something important during these tests. The vehicle did not demand careful handling. It forgave mistakes. It kept going even when driven hard by tired hands. That kind of reliability built trust quickly. As word spread through training units, skepticism turned into curiosity. Then curiosity turned into respect. Officers realized this vehicle could become a tool for every unit, not just support roles. Infantry could use it. Medics could use it. Engineers could use it. Commanders could use it. It was not specialized, and that was its greatest strength. It could be adapted for almost any task the battlefield demanded. By the time final evaluations were complete, the decision was clear. This was not a perfect machine. But it was exactly what the war required. Production orders followed at a staggering pace. Factories shifted schedules. Workers pushed to meet demand. The vehicle that had once been doubted was now becoming standard equipment for an army preparing to fight across the world. The Willys Jeep had been born under pressure, shaped by necessity rather than tradition. It was never meant to impress generals or intimidate enemies at first glance. Its purpose was far more important. It was built to move, to connect, and to endure. And soon, it would face its real test far from the controlled environment of training grounds. The real test of the Willys Jeep did not come on smooth roads or open fields. It came in places where war stripped away every advantage except reliability. As the first Jeeps reached active units, they were pushed immediately into harsh conditions. Mud clogged roads after heavy rain. Snow hid rocks and holes that destroyed heavier vehicles. Steep slopes forced engines to work at their limits. The Jeep was not treated gently. Soldiers drove it hard because they had no choice. In these early deployments, failure would have been obvious and deadly. A broken vehicle could leave men stranded under fire. A stalled engine could delay an attack or stop a medical evacuation. But again and again, the Jeep kept moving. Its light weight allowed it to cross ground that swallowed trucks. Its four-wheel drive pulled it through terrain that maps barely described. Soldiers learned they could rely on it to reach places that had previously been inaccessible. Trust spread quickly. Infantry units began using Jeeps to move ammunition and supplies closer to the front lines. Medics used them to evacuate wounded men faster than stretchers ever could. Commanders used them to move between units, allowing them to see the battlefield firsthand instead of relying only on reports. The Jeep became a constant presence, appearing wherever speed mattered more than protection. There was no single dramatic moment that defined its success. Instead, its value revealed itself through repetition. Every time it arrived on time. Every time it carried a wounded soldier to safety. Every time it delivered orders that prevented confusion. These small moments added up. The Jeep was not winning battles on its own, but it was making everything else work better. Soldiers began modifying the vehicle in the field. They mounted machine guns on it. They added stretchers. They strapped extra fuel and equipment to its frame. The Jeep accepted these changes without complaint. Its simple design allowed it to be adapted quickly for new tasks. It became a platform rather than just a vehicle, shaped by the needs of the men who used it. By the time American forces prepared for major operations in Europe, the Jeep had earned a reputation that no official report could fully capture. It was seen as dependable. It was seen as tough. Most importantly, it was seen as essential. The men who relied on it understood something that enemy observers did not. War was not only about firepower. It was about being in the right place at the right time. That understanding would soon be tested on a scale unlike anything before. Across the English Channel, a massive invasion was coming. And when American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Jeep would be there with them from the very first hours. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, chaos ruled every moment. Smoke filled the air. Explosions tore through sand and steel. Units became separated almost immediately. In those opening hours, speed and communication mattered as much as courage. As landing craft dropped their ramps, soldiers poured forward under fire. Among the tanks and artillery pieces came something smaller, quieter, and far more mobile. The Willys Jeep rolled onto French soil with the first waves. The beaches were only the beginning. Beyond them lay hedgerows, narrow lanes, and shattered villages. Roads were broken by bombs or blocked by debris. Tanks struggled to maneuver in the tight countryside. Trucks lagged behind. The Jeep moved through gaps, along farm paths, and across open fields where heavier vehicles could not go. It carried officers trying to regain control of scattered units. It carried radio operators rushing to restore communication. It carried ammunition to men who were running low and wounded soldiers who could not wait. In Normandy, the Jeep proved its greatest strength. It allowed commanders to see the fight directly. Instead of relying on delayed reports, they could move forward, observe conditions, and adjust plans in real time. Orders that once took hours to deliver could now arrive in minutes. That speed saved lives. It prevented confusion. It turned fragile footholds into organized advances. As the fighting pushed inland, the Jeep became even more vital. The hedgerow country forced slow and careful movement. German defenses were hidden and deadly. Every delay increased the risk of ambush. The Jeep's ability to move quickly allowed American forces to probe, react, and exploit openings. It was not protected by armor, but its speed often kept it ahead of danger. Soldiers trusted it to get them out as quickly as it brought them in. Medical units depended on it heavily. Under fire, Jeeps raced forward to retrieve wounded men. Each trip shortened the time between injury and treatment. That difference meant survival for thousands. Engineers used Jeeps to scout routes and place explosives. Messengers used them when radios failed. In every role, the Jeep became a link holding the battlefield together. By the time Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the Jeep was everywhere. It did not dominate photographs like tanks or bombers. It did not inspire fear at a distance. But it was present at nearly every critical moment. From the beaches to the countryside beyond, it quietly shaped the pace of the campaign. The war, however, was not confined to France. While the Jeep proved itself in Europe, it was already serving in places even more hostile. From deserts to jungles, its next challenge would test whether its success was limited or truly universal. While the fighting in Europe drew most of the world's attention, the Willys Jeep was already proving that its value did not depend on one battlefield or one climate. In North Africa, it crossed vast stretches of desert where heat destroyed engines and sand clogged every moving part. The Jeep survived by being simple. Its mechanics were easy to understand. Soldiers could fix it with basic tools and limited supplies. When other vehicles broke down and waited for parts, the Jeep kept moving. In Italy, it climbed narrow mountain roads under constant threat of ambush. These routes were too tight for large vehicles and too dangerous to walk. The Jeep carried officers, scouts, and messengers along steep cliffs and winding passes. One mistake could send it over the edge, yet it remained the fastest way to move through terrain shaped by centuries of warfare. It did not replace tanks or trucks. It filled the gaps between them. That role made it indispensable. In Burma and across the jungles of Southeast Asia, the challenge changed again. Roads vanished entirely. Rain turned paths into rivers of mud. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Here, the Jeep became a lifeline. It hauled supplies to isolated units and evacuated wounded men through ground that seemed impassable. Its low profile allowed it to move under thick canopy. Its durability allowed it to endure constant moisture and heat. The same vehicle that crossed French farmland now fought a completely different war. In the Pacific, the Jeep landed on island beaches under fire just as it had in Normandy. Once ashore, it moved across volcanic sand, coral rock, and dense vegetation. Marines and soldiers used it to move weapons forward and carry casualties back. On islands where space was limited and conditions brutal, every piece of equipment had to justify its presence. The Jeep did so every single day. What made this remarkable was not that the Jeep performed well in one environment, but that it performed well in all of them. Snow, sand, mud, jungle, and rock tested every weakness. The Jeep adapted without major redesign. Its core purpose remained the same. Move fast. Carry what matters. Keep going. That consistency built a level of trust rarely seen in wartime equipment. By now, even enemy forces had begun to notice. Captured Jeeps were quickly put back into service. German units used them when they could. They recognized their usefulness immediately. The vehicle that had once been mocked was now being copied, studied, and relied upon by both sides. The laughter was gone. What remained understood? The Jeep was not powerful because of what it carried on its frame. It was powerful because of what it allowed armies to do. And that realization marked a turning point in how modern war was fought. As the war dragged on, German commanders were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. The small American vehicle they had once laughed at was now everywhere. It appeared at front lines, command posts, and supply routes. It moved faster than their expectations and reached places they believed were secure. Captured Jeeps were quickly repainted and pressed into German service. Officers who had dismissed them now relied on them. This change in attitude revealed a deeper shift. German military doctrine had been built around structure and control. Movements were planned carefully and executed according to rigid schedules. That approach had worked well early in the war. But as conditions worsened and fronts stretched thin, flexibility became more valuable than precision. The Jeep represented a different philosophy. It allowed small units to adapt on the move. It allowed commanders to respond instead of react. German engineers examined captured Jeeps closely. They noted the simplicity of the design, the ease of repair, the balance between power and weight. They understood that the Americans had not built a perfect vehicle. They had built a practical one. This was a difficult lesson. The Jeep did not outgun German equipment. It outperformed it where it mattered most in speed, in availability, and in reliability under pressure. On the battlefield, this difference became increasingly clear. American units were able to coordinate faster. Messages moved quickly when radios failed. Reinforcements arrived sooner. Wounded men were evacuated before shock set in. None of these actions made headlines, but together they shaped the tempo of combat. The Jeep helped the Americans maintain momentum, even in difficult conditions. By contrast, German forces struggled with fuel shortages and mechanical failures. Heavier vehicles required more maintenance and more resources. When supply lines broke down, mobility suffered. The Jeep's efficiency stood in sharp contrast. It used less fuel. It required fewer parts. It could be kept running under circumstances that grounded other vehicles entirely. The laughter that had once surrounded the Jeep was replaced by quiet respect and growing frustration. German officers now understood what they had underestimated. War was no longer only about dominating the enemy with superior machines. It was about sustaining movement and communication under constant pressure. The Jeep had become a symbol of that truth. This realization did not change the outcome overnight. But it highlighted a fundamental shift in warfare. Victory increasingly depended on adaptability rather than brute strength. And the Jeep had become one of the clearest expressions of that idea on the battlefield. By the later years of the war, the impact of the Willys Jeep could no longer be measured by numbers alone. Its true influence was seen in how the battlefield functioned. Armies move on information, timing, and coordination. The Jeep quietly improved all three. Commanders who once relied on fixed headquarters could now move freely. They could observe conditions directly, speak to units face to face, and make decisions based on reality instead of delayed reports. That mobility shortened decision time, and in war, time is often the difference between success and disaster. The Jeep also transformed logistics at the smallest level. Large supply trucks handled bulk transport, but they could not always reach the final destination. The Jeep filled that last gap. It carried ammunition to forward positions, food to isolated units, and water to men cut off by terrain or enemy fire. These were not dramatic missions, but they kept units fighting. A soldier with ammunition and food could hold a position longer. A unit that stayed supplied could maintain pressure on the enemy. Over time, those small advantages accumulated into strategic momentum. Medical care was another area where the Jeep changed outcomes. Speed mattered more than comfort. The faster a wounded soldier reached treatment, the better his chances of survival. Jeeps were often the first vehicles to reach the injured. They moved under fire, across broken ground, and through conditions where stretchers were too slow. Thousands of men lived because minutes were saved. That reality was understood deeply by those who served, even if it never appeared in official statistics. The Jeep also reshaped how soldiers thought about equipment. It was not specialized, and that was its strength. A single Jeep could serve as transport in the morning, a command vehicle in the afternoon, and a medical evacuation platform by night. Soldiers mounted radios, machine guns, and stretchers as needed. This adaptability encouraged initiative. Units no longer waited for perfect tools. They used what they had and made it work. That mindset aligned closely with American operational culture and gave it an edge. Historians later recognized this shift as a turning point in modern warfare. Battles were still decided by tanks, aircraft, and artillery, but wars were sustained by mobility and coordination. The Jeep did not replace heavy weapons. It made them more effective by ensuring they were in the right place at the right time. It connected the battlefield into a functioning system. In this sense, the Jeep was not just a vehicle. It was an enabler. It allowed an army spread across continents to act with speed and coherence. German commanders eventually understood this, but by then the advantage had already been realized. The war was moving faster than rigid systems could handle. And the Jeep was built for movement. When the war finally ended, the Willys Jeep remained behind as quiet evidence of how much had changed. More than 600,000 of them had been built, scattered across every major theater of the conflict. They were worn, scarred, and often patched together, but many were still running. Soldiers did not see them as machines anymore. They saw them as companions that had carried them through danger and exhaustion. Few pieces of equipment earned that level of trust. Senior American commanders understood its importance clearly. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later reflected on what made victory possible and named the Jeep as one of the essential tools of the war. Not because it destroyed the enemy, but because it allowed the army to function. It moved leaders, connected units, and kept operations alive under pressure. In a conflict defined by scale and destruction, this small vehicle had proven that simplicity could be decisive. After the war, the Jeep did not disappear. Its design moved into civilian life, influencing transportation, industry, and culture. Farmers used it. Explorers used it. Families drove it. The same qualities that made it successful in war made it useful in peace: strength, reliability, and adaptability. It became a symbol of American ingenuity, built not for appearance but for purpose. The reaction of the German generals at the start of the war now feels almost inevitable. They had judged the Jeep by how it looked. They measured it against tanks and heavy vehicles and found it lacking. What they missed was how wars are truly won not only by force, but by movement, and not only by firepower, but by connection. The Jeep embodied that truth in a way few machines ever have. In the end, the The Jeep did not roar across the battlefield like a tank or strike from the sky like a bomber. It did something quieter and more important. It made everything else work. It turned chaos into coordination. It gave soldiers and commanders the ability to adapt in a world that refused to stand still. That is why the Jeep matters. That is why it is remembered. And that is why the vehicle that once inspired laughter helped win a war.